Welcome to the C.S. Joseph podcast. I am your host for this episode, Chris Taylor, also known as Raka, bringing you another Acolyte question today. Now, today's question is, as a parent, how do I help my child become subdeveloped without sheltering them? This is a fantastic question, but unfortunately, for what I think you are trying to get out of it, I feel like it's the wrong question to be asking. There's an idea that, we've always talked about subconscious developed people tend to be more happy and unconscious developed people tend to be more mature. Now, if you haven't seen my video kind of talking about these two factors, definitely go check that out, because I do have a specific video talking about these two things and what happiness versus maturity actually means from the standpoint of octagram and of development, because it's not quite so simple as, sub people are just happier and shadow people are just mature. So what I think that every parent wants when they're raising their children is for their children to be as happy and prosperous as possible. Oftentimes we don't want our children to go through hardships earlier than they have to. We hear mature and we initially think, I don't want my child to grow up too fast. I want them to be able to enjoy their time as a kid and be happy and be worry-free. But the fact of the matter is, even if this was true, cut and dry, sub was happy and shadow was mature, the thing is there isn't a lot that you can consciously do that's going to prevent entirely them from developing on one of these two paths or not. And hopefully by the end of the video, you understand that even if you could, it's not necessarily the route you'd want to take. It's kind of like you think you want something and you get there and it's not what you expected it to be. So let's talk about, again, what do we mean when we say happy, mature? I'll go over it a little bit here. But when it comes to subconscious developed, we tend to look at people who are subconscious developed as having a little more energy to deal with life's problems. The fact of the matter is, the people that are existing in their ego or in their subconscious are utilizing the top half of the mind, the half of the mind where they're already spending time naturally with the type that they were born into. Whereas with shadow developed, shadow focused people, they're reaching outside of their ego and developing the lower half of the functions and going outside of what is typically natural for them. People that are doing that, obviously it's like working a muscle. You're going to tire yourself out. It's exercise. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. What causes somebody to be shadow focused or sub focused or shadow or sub developed in the first place is, let's take a look at subconscious focused or ego. What this basically means is they're able to spend more time in their ego functions as a whole. Environment, that is what causes the shift between these two. So when you are able to spend more time in your ego, what this means is that your ego functions are more accepted in your environment. Now, what this means is that wherever the child is spending more time or has a higher value towards, whether that's parent, friends, school, their social group as a whole, whether or not those ego functions are accepted is going to more determine whether or not they're ego focused or shadow focused. If those functions, if they end up finding that their shadow functions are more widely accepted in their social groups or by their parent, then they're likely going to spend more time at that side of the mind. Sheltering is a factor, but when you shelter then we're strictly looking at, okay, what does this mean? This means that you are making yourself their primary interaction point. Sheltering them can actually still make them shadow developed if you're not compatible with their ego functions. If you are compatible with their ego functions, sheltering will likely develop their subconscious in a vacuum. Now, there's a lot of other factors. What your actual relationship to your child is going to play a big role in this. It's not just as simple as, oh, we're compatible together, and so if I'm their only, interaction, then obviously they're going to develop subconscious. That is where it would lead if you guys had a perfectly ideal relationship and there was no problems. They did not, as hard as this is to accept, if they do not reject your interactions with them. Because even if you're compatible with your child, if you're sheltering them and you're their primary source of socialization, and they have an issue, there's an issue between you and them, they're probably going to go to their shadow as a means of rebelling and pushing away. Now, this obviously is going to depend on age groups. When it comes to children, they go through several different phases of interaction with their parents as they grow older. Obviously when they're born and they're young, toddlers, babies, they rely on you for everything. As they get older, this becomes less and less so. So the next age group is, we'll say between 4, the end of toddler, beginning of childhood, between 4 and the start of adolescence, and we'll say, just for the sake of argument, like 11, 12 years old, right? That phase, typically speaking, is the phase that they are most connected with their parents, and this is where you have the most influence with your child. Now, depending on how this phase of your relationship with them goes, is going to set the stage for the next phase, which is adolescence, where everything in their body and their biology is trying to tell them to step away from you as the parent and start becoming a young adult. And so in this phase, depending on what your relationship with them was in the prior phase, this phase is going to go a few different ways. But typically speaking, if that prior phase was rocky, they don't feel like they can trust you, they don't feel like they can come to you, this is where they're going to branch out, and their friend groups are going to become far more big of an influence than you are in their life. And regardless of what your relationship with them is in that prior phase, this is still going to happen. It's just to what extent do you still play a role? Now, this is all to essentially say that you are never going to be the entirety of the influence on your child. The peak is, that 4 to 12-year-old range, but even then, they're still likely going to have friends. And also, whether or not you shelter them is kind of a wild card too. I will say that, typically speaking, sheltering is going to cause a lot more of a rocky relationship with them when they start to get into adolescence. But it's not the primary driving factor. Now, the next point is, do you actually even want to make sure that they are subconscious developed over shadow developed in the first place, or unconscious developed in the first place? It kind of depends. So what essentially happens when somebody is subconscious developed or subconscious focused is, yes, they tend to be a little happier. They are operating with more energy in the 4 functions that they were basically born into, and they're overcoming their primary anxiety or the fear associated with their development into the subconscious. So that inferior function is becoming stronger. This is the point where, I shamelessly plug that we are coming out with a course with Chase and John Bodine called Ego Hacking Your Fear. It is very relevant to this in subdevelopment. So make sure you guys check that out. So with subconscious development, they're operating in those 4 top functions in the ego stack, and you're going to have a lot more energy. But what's the downside of this? The downside is that eventually life is going to throw a curveball that your ego functions are not equipped to deal with. Sometimes your shadow functions won't be either. But I digress. More often than not, if your ego functions don't handle something, your shadow functions can at least make do. Because between the 2 of them, you have all 8 functions of cognition, just with different attitudes and the functions. So what you're essentially doing is, in the long run, if you're subconscious developed, you're going to hit a snag that is going to be far more impactful on your life, potentially in a negative way, sometimes in a positive way. But what you're doing is specializing in one thing and having less of a net to cover your bases. On the flip side of things, with your shadow developed people, they're going to be less energetic. They're accounting for more functions on a regular basis than your subconscious developed person is. And so they're going to be more mentally drained in a one-to-one comparison. Okay? It also means, though, that they are not as specialized with either set of functions. So it really comes down to this jack of all trades, master of none kind of situation, in a sense. So realistically, then, with all of that said, what is our role as a parent in octogram, in typology, and understanding our children's types? Well, it's just that. It's understanding. It is, the idea is to understand what their octogram is so that you can better understand the pitfalls that they may reach, and so that you can better assist them as they're growing into adulthood. It is our responsibility as parents to understand our children, but also to accept that while we are responsible for them, while we're responsible for their safety, their health and well-being, especially up until adulthood, we also have to recognize that they are growing into an autonomous adult eventually. So what we should be doing is working towards assisting them to be self-sufficient, so that when they become an adult, they are able to handle life's problems as adequately as they can. Every human's going to go through problems. You can't save them from the problems of the world. The best we can do is teach them, okay, well, when things go wrong, here's how we figure that out. So, the idea, in my opinion, is don't try to force a specific octogram out of your children. Because no matter what you think is the ideal side of the mind for them, life's going to challenge them regardless. Life is going to kick them regardless of whether or not they are sub or shadow developed. Instead, try to understand your children. Try to understand the pitfalls that are going to come with their type and their octogram, so that you can better help them when they run into challenges that they are not able to handle on their own. Anyway, I hope you guys found this episode useful, helpful, insightful. Please leave a comment if you have any questions down below. I at least read through all the comments. I try to answer as many questions as I can. And with all that said, we'll catch you guys on the next video. Have a good night.